It used to be when you were shopping for a lens, you'd have to choose between prime lenses and zoom lenses. Zoom lenses being the versatile choice and prime lenses being the fast choice, with unlimited ability to blur the background and shoot in low light conditions. Well, Sigma has a new release on the market which is going to blur the lines between the prime lens and the zoom lens. The very exciting new lens from Sigma, the 24-45 f1.8 DG DN art lens, the world's fastest full-frame zoom lens. Let's talk about the specs of this exciting new lens. So first, the focal length. The focal length of this lens is not a traditional focal length. It's a 28-45 millimeter, which puts it right kind of in the middle between your traditional 16-35 f2.8 and your traditional 24-70 f2.8 that make up two lenses in the holy trinity of zooms. And when you're using those two lenses, you've got the wide for like landscapes and big open shots, and then the other lens, the 24-70, is more of a catch-all zoom where you can do wide, but you can also do telephoto work. This lens comes in right in the middle at a interesting focal length, but still very usable, I think, as a video shooter myself. A 28-45 is not the end of the world, still a very usable range. And then we go to the maximum aperture. I mean, f1.8, just leave your primes at home, right? Like, I carry a 24, 35, and 50 prime with me when I go and do work, and this, if I'm cool with that f1.8, that kills all of those primes, at least in theory. So very interesting to see the world's fastest full-frame zoom lens. I cannot believe my eyes are seeing 1.8 and a full-frame zoom. This is incredible. Honestly, it is. So obviously the lens covers full-frame format, and it's going to come out on June 20th for the Sony E and Panasonic L mount cameras. So those are typically the mounts that Sigma makes their lenses for, and there's no word currently on whether or not the lens is going to come out for RF mount yet. Now, as a quick note, RF shooters will have that Canon lens. I think it's the 28-70 f2, which is also a very interesting proposition in terms of fast zooms. I would encourage you to check that out if you are a Canon shooter. Continuing with the specs, you're going to have Sigma's great autofocus. I haven't had a lens in recent time that I've had issues with the autofocus. We're going to see if Sigma autofocus in this lens holds up to some of the GM products on Sony, so I'm going to wait and see for that. This lens does not have any form of optical image stabilization, so steady hands and maybe some in-body stabilization could benefit you if you're using this lens. The filter size on the front is 82 millimeters, which is pretty big for a lens, but not off base for Sigma products. Their 24-70 zoom lens is also an 82 millimeter filter thread. So if you're one of those shooters who likes to buy just 82s and then adapt them all down to your other smaller lenses, this one fits right in and you won't have to use any filter adapters with an 82 millimeter filter. The minimum focus distance is an interesting one because commonly on zooms it changes. So for example, the Sony GM 24-70 Mark II, the minimum focus distance on the wide is about 8.25 inch, whereas if you go all the way to the telephoto on the 70, it's a full 12 inches. Now, the minimum focus distance on this lens is not great. It's 11.9 inches, but it is constant, which could be an interesting selling point if you don't want to have to remember kind of where your minimum focus distance is. The lens has 18 elements in 15 groups and 11 diaphragm blades, which are rounded and will give you a great clear bokeh, hopefully, with that 1.8 aperture. That's going to be incredible for subject separation. And finally, we get to the physical build of the lens. So let's talk about weight, and that's something that Sigma has not struggled with, but has been a consideration historically when shopping for Sigma lenses. Sigma lenses, just in general, are a bit on the heavy side, but not to their detriment. They've got a solid metal build, and their weatherproofing is, in my opinion, quite good. I've never had an issue with sealing on a Sigma lens, and I don't anticipate that to start now. That being said, this lens is almost 1 kilogram heavy. It's 950 grams, which is about 1.5 times heavier than the Sony GM 24-70, which has more range. Now, you have to understand that when you get a bigger aperture, you are inherently adding more glass and everything's getting a bit more complicated. So I don't fault Sigma for building a heavy lens, and I think the fact that people are going to want to see this fast zoom lens, I don't think the weight is going to be a principal point of concern, but it is something to note. Talking more about the physical build of the lens, it's going to be built like every other Sigma product, so heavy, kind of tanky. The lens also comes with Sigma's current design language, which sees the use of programmable buttons on the lens, as well as a physical aperture ring similar to the Sony products, again the GM products, which allows you to change the aperture manually if you want to. And finally, finally, what is the price of this lens? Well, the lens is going to be $1,349 USD. Now, that's a very competitive price compared to the G Master products from Sony and even some of Sigma's other offerings. To give you some perspective, the new 24-70 f2.8 DG-DN Mark II lens from Sigma, a sequel to their highly popular 24-70, is going to come in at $1,199 American, so you will pay a bit of a premium going with that faster aperture. But honestly, those are kind of different lenses at this point, so it all depends on what you need for your use case. Sigma is touting this lens as a spiritual successor to one of its most popular lenses, a lens that I've personally owned and used, the 18-35 Super 35 lens, which is a staple of, Micro Four Thirds and Super 35 filmmaking. It's absolutely awesome. People pair them with speed boosters and they get crazy fast. I love that lens, and Sigma loves that lens. I mean, Sigma loves that lens so much they offer it in a cine housing for thousands and thousands more, and people love that lens. So calling this lens a spiritual successor to something with that much clout and that much notoriety in the camera space, Sigma's putting a lot of money on this lens. They're betting big. So now let's talk about the use case. Who do I see using this lens? Well, I see photographers working in that wider end of the range, really loving this lens if they can make do with the weight. If you're slinging this camera or have it on your belt and you've got a kilogram mass on the end, you're going to be cognizant of that, and it's going to take up a fair bit of your kit. That being said, it kills prime lenses, so low light performance is going to be much better than your standard zoom lens. Obviously, it's not your portrait king, or you're not doing any wildlife or maybe not even any action unless you can get really close up. But for photographers who do work more on the wide end, this could be quite good. I don't see it being a studio lens. I see it more being used for events. Now, speaking more to my profession, video shooting, I personally would love this lens for run and gun events. I think it's built to be on a gimbal because it's internally focusing and zooming, so you're going to stay perfectly balanced, even though today's gimbals are pretty forgiving when you zoom in and out. That being said, I do a lot of just like walking around shooting with like an easy rig or, any form of support for events, and this focal range is excellent, and paired with the fast aperture, I think it could really save me from shifting primes here and there. I don't really like the term run and gun. I think it's kind of a catch-all, but if I did have to use it in this instance, I would say run and gun filmmaking, this is going to be a great lens for that. I have to say though, in truth, I was really blown away by this claim and this lens, the fastest full-frame lens that's a zoom lens, and it's really fast. It's 1.8. And then I remembered that Sigma's kind of already made a similar lens, and it didn't really change the ecosystem. So in 2015, Sigma came out with the 24-35 f2 full-frame lens, at the time touted as the fastest zoom lens. I don't know, I haven't seen it out very often. Obviously, I had to kind of look it up for this video. To my knowledge, it's a perfectly suitable lens, but it didn't really change the landscape in the way that a lot of people are kind of purporting this one will. So I do have to temper my expectations as to how much this lens is going to change things. Going from f2 to f1.8, that's not as big of a jump as 2.8 to 2. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that I think the general public really likes fast glass. I mean, it's obvious. We want it to be faster and faster. We also like the versatility of zooms. But I would say my observation when it comes to this lens would be that people, when shopping for zoom lenses, generally shop focal length and not necessarily speed. I mean, we've kind of been conditioned that all zoom lenses, once you get to a certain level, the pro level, are all quite good. I mean, they've all been 2.8 for the longest time. And so people, I think, in current times shop on focal length. A lens that I think is indicative of this is the success of the Tamron 35-150. Now, that was a very popular lens that Tamron released, and I saw it a bunch on E-mount. And people generally were very happy with that lens, despite the fact that it had a variable aperture, which was kind of contentious at the time. It was a 2 to 2.8 along that 35-150, but I saw a lot of people get great use out of that lens because of its focal length. And of course, it was fast too, going down to 2. But people really liked that range because it allowed them to buy one lens instead of multiple. And now we're getting great lenses like on the Canon side with the 24-105, that's a 2.8, and that's just a longer 24-70. So I think advancements in focal length have really got people excited about what new zoom lenses could look like. And now we come back to the argument of the speed is really what sells the lens. And I think this lens is really enticing. But do I think it's going to have a major impact on the camera market? I don't think so. Until we see a more traditional zoom lens in focal length hit one of these speeds, I think it still will be kind of a niche lens because it's a niche focal length. I'm not saying it's not an engineering marvel and an absolute miracle that a non-first party brand was able to create this. I'm just saying, I think in the long run, it won't necessarily get the respect it deserves, but I certainly am looking forward to testing it, and I hope you guys stick around, because if I can get my hands on one, it will certainly come onto this channel. So that was my opinion on the new Sigma 28-45 f1.8 zoom lens, the world's fastest full-frame zoom lens. Really excited. Like I always say, it's the best time ever to be a creative in terms of the tools we have available, and I really appreciate companies innovating and showing us something new. Again, in my entire life, I never really thought, I mean, I knew we'd have improvements, but I never really thought that we'd see a 1.8 zoom on full frame. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you very much. And if you do leave a comment, I read every single one, and I will try my best to get back to you. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video, or when Sigma drops another cool lens.